Welcome to the Gurleyville Grist Mill. People ask me what's so special about this place, and I think the most special thing about it is that unlike a historical exhibit, this is a place that operated as a grist mill, and yet in the 1940s the family that owned it pretty much closed the doors, shut it up, and kept people away from it. So what you have here is a snapshot in time of a country grist mill that was just as the family left it. And that allows us to talk about a lot of different aspects of it that people find pretty interesting. Now, what's a grist mill? Grist mill is a place where grain was ground. That was important because prior to, say, World War II, most families in eastern Connecticut, most families in Mansfield were farming families, and they needed to get their grain ground on a regular basis. Feed, once it's ground, does not keep. So if you're feeding chickens, you're feeding your dairy cows, you're feeding your horses, which provide the motive power on the farm, you have to go to a grist mill at least once a week, if not more often, to get the feed ground so that they have fresh feed to eat. It was a vital part of every community that relied on agriculture. The heart of the operation are these two sets or runs of grindstones. And they're pretty much the same. The principle is this. There are two stones, one on the bottom that's fixed and one on the top that's revolving. Perhaps 100, 125 RPMs. They don't actually rest on each other. The revolving stone is very small distance above the fixed stone, maybe the width of a piece of paper. So the process is pretty simple. The farmer will bring in a bushel or sack, bring in the raw grain, be it shelled corn or buckwheat, wheat, whatever. And the raw grain is dumped into the hopper. It doesn't go into the stone all at once because there's this agitator here that is just allowing a little bit of grain to pass into the eye of the stone at the time. And when these are running, it makes kind of a clicking sound. And in the somewhat sexist terminology of the day, that chattering led to this part of it being called the damsel. I didn't invent it, I'm just reporting it. At any rate, with the chattering sound, a small amount of grain would go into the eye of the stone and then would pass between the two stones and get reduced to a fine powder. It wasn't so much being crushed as cut. The stones have very sharp edges that have been cut into them. So it's almost like a shearing action with a set of scissors. The grain is being cut by the action of the stones. The spinning of the stone creates a certain amount of air pressure called the wind that tends to move the grain to the periphery of the vat. And from the periphery of the vat, there's a small hole in the side of the vat, and there's a conveyor belt that is running that will carry the ground grain up into this bagging stand. At the bagging stand, the miller can take a paddle and fill the sack full of ground feed or ground flour and cornmeal, whatever, and then the farmer can take the sack home. This device, called the bolter, is essentially a giant flour sifter. And how it worked is this. If you look closely, you can see that this revolving cylinder is slightly inclined from that end to this end. So flour would be carried by the conveyor belt into that end of the bolter, and as it's rotating, it would be sifted out through this very fine cloth called bolting cloth and be deposited in the trough here. Now, depending on how you set up the cylinder with bolting cloth, you could get various grades of flour. Right now, this is just set up for a very fine grade of flour at that end, and then everything else is a medium grain of flour. And then all the whole wheat parts, the kernels, the etc., go in here and are discarded. You know, today we really want the whole wheat flour, right? We're all kind of crunchy. But in those days, people wanted a purest white flour they could get. So they were perhaps not as concerned about whole wheat flour as we would be. Then the flour would accumulate in this trough, and then these open up, and the flour would descend into this. And again, you would take a paddle and you would fill a sack with flour. So this shows how the miller would remove the top stone so as to sharpen the stones. And we've already taken off the vat and the other wooden parts, and we put the crane into position, and the ends of the crane are pegged into the two sides of the top stone. And were I to keep turning this like this, I would actually be lifting the stone up off the bottom stone. Compared with Europe, from colonial times onward, America has always had a relative labor shortage. So Americans were anxious to save labor wherever possible and to make mechanical things so that the fewest number of people were needed to operate them. In fact, the arrangement that you see in the Gurleyville Grist Mill came to be known as an American mill because it was so geared towards one or two people being able to operate everything. And an example of that is where I'm standing now. If you imagine me as the miller, then everything is at my immediate access within one or two steps. For example, I want to turn the water power on or off. So I operate this wheel, which closes a gate or opens a gate, either keeping water out or letting water into the turbine that powers the whole operation. If I wanted to adjust the grindstones height, here is the lever for adjusting how far apart the two stones are from each other. Now, you'll notice there's a lot of machines in here. You wouldn't have them all running simultaneously. So every machine has got a lever like this that, in essence, turns the machine on or turns it off. Each run of stones has a lever like this. The corn sheller here has a lever. That's the on-off switch for individual machines, whereas this is the on-off switch for the power as a whole. So everything is oriented towards one or two people being able to carry out the entire operation. And that's the real essence of the American mill. The technology that you see in the Gurleyville Grist Mill, or really in any country mill, is not fine craftsmanship, but neither is it slipshod. It's utilitarian. It's done in a way that it will work. And that was the main thing. And when you think about it, for well over 100 years, this grist mill operated flawlessly. And I think there's no better example of that extemporized kind of just make it work than this particular feature right here. I mentioned it with that run of stones. You could either bag it for a coarse animal feed or direct it into the bolter for flour. And what turns the bolter on or off is this set of bevel gears here. And this end of the shaft actually can be rotated. And if you want the bolter to start working, then you take out this big old spike and you engage the bevel gears together and the bolter starts up. When you want the bolter to stop, you move this lever and insert the pin. The gears go out of engagement and the bolter stops. That's the level of technology that's here. It's not so much sophisticated as it is ingenious in its simplicity and its utilitarian aspect. One thing to keep in mind about the 19th century and the early 20th century is that power was really scarce. The dam that impounded the water that allowed this mill to run on water power produced, on a good day, maybe 30 horsepower. Think about that. I mean, that's like your Volkswagen in terms of horsepower. So power was scarce, and as a result, whenever you were generating power at a site like this, you used it for as many different things as you could. Very often, as in the case of the Gurleyville Grist Mill, it was combined with a sawmill operation. So at one end of the building, they originally had a sawmill. In fact, the sawmill kept going a little bit longer than the grist mill. But also in this corner of the building, the family had a little woodworking shop. Again, because the power was scarce, they used it for whatever they could. And they had a lathe here, and they had a table saw, and probably other woodworking tools as well. One of the things you see here is this pattern for a piece of architectural woodwork. And if you go across the street, you will see the little ornamental brackets that they made on that house across the street, which we would assume were made here at the Gurleyville Grist Mill, because here's the pattern for making them. Down here in the lower level, you see all the gearing that makes the operation level work. The power came into the building from the adjacent sawmill on the main shaft. There's a set of bevel gears there, and then the 2 runs of stones are powered off that central shaft that runs up from those bevel gears. And here you see, when I said you could turn the water on and off, here you see the set of bevel gears that actually do that. So when I was turning that wheel up on the operating floor, I was actually turning these bevel gears that would have started or stopped the flow of water through the turbine that powered it. Now this is the second configuration of the guts of the grist mill. We know that originally there was a very large wooden water wheel in the cellar here that would have occupied most of the center part of the cellar. So this stuff wouldn't have been there. The model that we have upstairs shows that large wooden water wheel that would have revolved in this direction. And the evidence for that is the bearing seats are still in place. So we know where that was. Around 1870, there was a revolution in small mill technology, which was the use of manufactured turbines in place of water wheels. Turbines were fairly small, they were machined with very close tolerances, and they were extremely efficient. A water wheel might have an efficiency of 30%, a turbine efficiency could be as high as 85%. And everywhere, even country millers like the ones that ran this place, saw a great advantage in converting over to the use of turbines. And that meant that this whole area was now open for use. And that's when the framing for the 2 runs of stones that we have now was put in. That's when all this gearing was put in, probably around 1870 or so. Well, I hope you enjoyed this virtual tour of the Gurleyville Grist Mill. There's a lot more to see, so I hope you'll come visit us soon.